The Grand Vizier of Oz by Cedri. Chapter 16. Sons of the Venkus. Year 23. Winter. As a building that was huge, famous, expensive, and fairly old, the Emerald Palace had something of a reputation to live up to. Buildings that are huge, famous, expensive, and fairly old tend to be stereotyped by those who don't live in them, and one of the expectations associated with that cliche is that somewhere deep inside there should be at least one secret room, hidden passage, or locked door guarding a splendid secret. Now, the Emerald Palace had no such mysteries, at least none that its principal denizens were aware of, but it did have a number of very normal little rooms that most people never knew about and few would ever imagine the purpose of. One such place was informally known as the Spying Lounge. It was a cozy little parlor that sat directly above the grand double doors of the palace's main entrance, and its large windows were draped in lace curtains that let people look out but not in, meaning that those sitting inside could know exactly when an important guest's carriage had just pulled up to the door. This was done, Glinda explained, so that the Queen, or whomever nowadays, could walk down to greet the arrivals at exactly the right moment, rather than risking the graceless tedium of being early or the rudeness of being late. On this particular day, heavy gray clouds that threatened rain or snow were dimming the usual green sparkle of the city. Elphaba was sitting behind the curtains, legs crossed, and impatiently toying with her pointed hat. Oscar was nearby, dressed up the way people expected of their wonderful wizard, and repeatedly stumbling over his embroidered hems. Glinda sparkled, of course, as beautiful as ever, but she wasn't acting the part. She was fretting, flipping through well-worn pages of a tiny notebook and trying to memorize as much as possible. Fiyero was nowhere to be found. After one of the papers tore in the rush, Elphaba rolled her eyes. "What are you worried about?" she asked her friend. "You've met them before." "Not in a formal setting, Elfie," replied Glinda, eyes fixed on the page. "Etiquette in the Venkus is nothing like in the rest of Oz, and I will not mess this up, no matter how— Oh, where did I put it?" she grumbled, flicking through her tattered notes and glancing repeatedly out the window. "Elfie, do you know what Fiero's great-grandfather's second wife was called?" "No, I don't think Fiero does either, but you can ask him." She paused. "Where is he, anyway?" "He's coming. There was some last-minute problem with a cake," said Oscar, who was finally managing to walk straight. "He said it won't take long." "It had better not," Glinda muttered darkly. "It's his family we're welcoming after all. All right, Oscar, do you know what the cooks said about tonight's dinner? The spiced tally meat and the sunpie?" "It's all arranged," he promised, patting her shoulder. "Glinda, please relax. Every one of us has met King Harald before, and somehow I doubt Fiero is going to stand on ceremony for his own family, especially not on his sister's birthday." "He might, actually," said Elphaba, sitting back in her chair, grinning wickedly. Glinda threatened him. Oscar's brow furrowed in puzzled amusement. "With what?" He never got an answer, though, for at that moment a deep blue carriage came into view far down the main road, and Glinda jumped to her feet. "Fiero!" she called, opening the hallway door. "Fiero, where are you?" A startled maid, who just happened to be right outside the door when Glinda opened it to shout, pressed a hand to her rapidly beating heart. I believe Prince Fiero is already at the gate, ma'am." "What? Ah!" In a flash, Glinda disappeared down the stairs. Oscar and Elphaba exchanged an amused glance, and there was a brief silence. "Do you think we should wait here?" asked the wizard. Elphaba considered it, lingering in thought for a few seconds longer than necessary, then shook her head. "She's probably suffered enough." Oscar chuckled and offered a hand to pull her out of the chair. A moment or so later, they stepped into the palace's vast, glimmering green entrance hall, and then out onto the main steps, each of which were long and wide enough to fit a grand piano. Glinda was already there, buttoning up an elegant winter coat lined with fake white fur, standing straight and tall while Fiero leaned against a wall, content. Elphaba discreetly took his hand. "Is it ready?" she asked. "Mm-hmm. 8 cakes, 8 kinds of chocolate, 8 ice creams, and 8 presents for my 8-year-old little sister." He shook his head. "Do you know how long it's been since I've seen her? She's going to be so big." "She's going to be so sick," Elphaba replied dryly. "Do you really expect her to eat all that?" "Oh, hell no. Most of it'll be left over for the rest of the week. It's the idea of it. She loves numbers. I taught her to count," he added proudly. "Ah," murmured Glinda, smiling as she tilted her head. You really love her, don't you? Favorite sibling, he replied shamelessly, and shrugged. I don't know why, really, but Meru, we've always gotten along really well, and better than with my brothers. If I recall, Diane's only 6, and you've barely lived in the same house as him for more than a few months. Better than with Nargene, then. A very light rain was starting to fall, so Fiyero stepped back a bit until he was under the huge ornate overhang, which already shielded Oscar and Glinda. Elphaba wasn't bothered by getting a bit wet, and would have stayed where she was if Glinda hadn't fiercely hissed something about hairstyles and fabrics. By this time, the blue carriage had rolled its way through the main gates, and the formal guard, whose sole purpose in life seemed to be to stand around looking pretty, had lined themselves up on either side of the path, stoically watching the misty rain hit their noses. The Venkin guards were just as stiff, climbing down to bow, before servants with umbrellas hurried to shield the Tigulars from the 3 or 4 tiny drops that were actually falling. Elphaba rolled her eyes. Something to block the frigid winter wind would have been more useful. Thankfully, for her sake, the first person to hop out of that carriage was Meru, and the chirpy little girl ignored formality about as often as her big brother did. Yahoo! She cried, jumping to the ground, heedless of the delicacy of her dress, and ran full speed along the path and up the stairs to be swept up in Fiero's usual and most enthusiastic hug. He spun her around, nearly hitting Oscar, but had to put her down faster than usual. Oz, you're tall! 4 whole feet, she announced proudly. Daddy measured me yesterday. Perfect for today, then. Exactly half. Fiero, still kneeling and ruffling her hair. Happy birthday, sis. Meru squealed and hugged him again. I missed you so much. Behind her, Haral and Nargene were stepping out of the carriage, taking their time so Meru could have her moment of glory. Little Diane and Fiero's mother Amadel were not coming, as the last-minute letter had informed them less than 2 days ago. Diane was sick, and Amadel wasn't comfortable having the entire royal family away from home all at once. It was a shame, but it only made Fiero more determined to make this day as perfect as possible. He was certainly coming close. You remember my friends Elphaba and Glinda, right? He asked Meru, straightening up and holding her hand as they stepped towards the more formal welcoming party. Meru looked a bit shy, but nodded and smiled, making a very proper curtsy to all of them, and she easily shook Elphaba's hand when the green woman wished her a happy birthday. Glinda did the same, adding a traditional Vinkin blessing that she'd memorized for the occasion, and then Fiero, still holding her hand, led his sister to the only person she hadn't met before. The wizard. Oscar, as was not all that surprising, loved children, and he smiled brilliantly as Meru greeted him, then leaned over to shake her hand and said, Happy birthday, Princess Meru. This is for you. From a pocket of his ridiculous robe, he produced a small box wrapped in emerald green paper, and the little girl's shyness melted away as she thanked him and set to opening the present. At that moment, Fiero turned to greet his father, shaking his hand and exchanging a few happy but hardly formal words, something which Glinda was sure to be frowning at. The quiet and sometimes sullen Nargene was next, and as Fiero turned from their father, his eyes landed on his brother's face. He stopped dead, all traces of a smile dropping from his mouth. Meru's gleeful thanks for whatever trinket she'd been given suddenly seemed very faint in the background. Elphaba, who stood directly to Fiero's left, furrowed her brow in confusion as he stared coldly, and Nargene looked down, shuffling his feet awkwardly. Then Fiero swung sharply toward his father, looking, for lack of a better word, betrayed. Haral just gave a very slight shake of the head and said, Little. Nargene seemed to take that as his cue, for he lifted his head and offered a hand, saying, Hello, brother. It's good to see you. Fiero looked back but didn't answer. His face remained dark, his back stiff, and his arms hung straight by his sides, hands curling into loose fists. From her angle, Elphaba could see the muscles in his jaw working as he grit his teeth. Eventually he just said, Nargene, in a flat voice with a slight nod, and spun on his heel and walked off, hooking an arm around Meru's shoulders and taking her inside, leaving the others behind without so much as a word. Elphaba was bewildered, and judging by the looks on Glinda and Oscar's faces, they were no less so. Nargene seemed embarrassed. Haral just looked sad.
An awkward silence reigned for a moment, broken only by the shuffle of soldiers' feet and Meru's fading voice as they walked away. She, too, was wondering what was wrong, but Fiyero was putting on a cheerful voice and asking if she'd like to open another present early, and that was distraction enough. Then, in a valiant attempt to salvage the formalities, and probably to console Glenda, who was visibly mortified, Nargene stepped up towards the rest of his hosts, and in so doing, he naturally turned to face them directly. The wind pushed his longish hair back from his brow, and suddenly Elphaba saw that the left side of his face had been tattooed with the same intricate pattern of tiny blue diamonds that, until now, she had only ever seen on King Harral. "Lady Elphaba," Nargene said politely, bowing a little and offering her his hand. She took it, shook it, and returned the greeting, and as Nargene moved on to Glinda and then the wizard, she turned to look at Harral. He offered no explanation, merely went through the motions of pleasant greetings with each of them. Oscar returned them with some discomfort, and then Glinda, trying to keep some of her precious etiquette alive, put on a bright smile and said, "Why don't we all go inside? I'm sure you'd like to settle in and unpack for a while, and I'm afraid the rain seems to be getting worse." Her offer of escape was taken up quickly, and soon all the greetings were over, the servants dismissed, and absolutely no answers given. Several hours later, neither Meru nor Fiyero had turned up. Optimistically, because it had been planned to the letter as part of their celebration, Glinda decided not to delay the dinner scheduled for sundown. Though considering all the trouble she'd put the cooks through trying to get it right, that might have been more to prevent a riot. As dusk fell, the hosts and guests, with two glaring exceptions, gathered to wait in a comfortable antechamber outside one of the smaller, but typically extravagant, formal dining rooms. Harral and Nargene were not talking. Not at least about what had upset Fiyero, which was clearly no mystery to them. Glinda was tense, trying her best to keep up the pretense that absolutely nothing was wrong, even though everyone knew better. She was striking up pleasant conversations with Oscar and Harral. Nargene, like Elphaba, didn't bother with the pretense and loitered silently in one corner. But nothing seemed to work. A topic would be offered, and the speakers would latch on, making their best effort. But the unspoken issue kept getting in the way, and after a few weak exchanges, they all faded into nothingness. Awkward silence reigned. Glinda kept hurrying to the door to speak with her assistants, who had been sent to search the palace, and each time they shook their heads, her smile became a little bit stiffer. When a butler arrived to inform them that dinner was served, she almost cried. However, it was less than a minute later that Meru and Fiyero waltzed in with no apologies, no formality, and no care, entirely absorbed in some chirpy conversation. Perhaps it was a coincidence, but Elphaba suspected that he was deliberately avoiding having to talk to anyone but his sister. And avoid them he most certainly did. Meru helped unknowingly. Although she was now old enough to know that something was wrong, she had been very effectively distracted. As soon as the door opened, she ran in and bounced on her father, excitedly waving 2 front-row tickets to her favorite musical, the first of Fiyero's ridiculous number of presents. "And guess what?" she cried, practically bouncing. "Yarrow says he knows the guy who plays Prince Lacal, and after the show he's promised to take us backstage!" Harral smiled at his daughter, glancing at Fiyero, who seemed calm and at ease, his intention entirely fixed on Meru. "That's wonderful," said the king. "I'm sure you'll have a great time. When's the performance?" "No need, Miss Eve," she replied, squealing in a very unprincess-like fashion. "I can't wait, I can't wait, I can't wait!" The adults all smiled indulgently at her, and Glinda, relieved, suggested that they step into the dining room. "We have another surprise for you," she told Meru, and Fiyero, grinning, stood behind his sister, covering her eyes with his hands and nudging her into a walk. After careful consideration, Glinda had decided to host Meru's birthday dinner in the Silver Room, which was fairly small by palace standards, and in which every surface and ornament was either white, black, or a shiny reflective silver. It looked impressively expensive without being obscenely so, though it had the unfortunate side effect of emphasizing every bit of color in the clothes, hair, or skin of the diners. Them and the 8 big cakes iced like rainbows, of course. Meru gasped, hands flying up to cover her mouth, and she turned to look at Fiyero with a look of total delight. 8 cakes? She asked. He grinned. 8. For after dinner. warned Harral, who had known nothing of this surprise, though he seemed to approve. "Have some real food first. We don't want you to get sick." He nodded at Fiyero, who was extremely pleased with himself, but Nargene, on the other hand, was looking sad? This family, Elphaba decided, was impossible to figure out. Like Glinda, Oscar was pretending that everything was fine. He invited the birthday girl to sit beside him, a privilege which half of Oz would have cheerfully killed for, and which Meru, who was still a well-educated Vinkin princess, understood the honor of. She accepted with a very proper curtsy, then dashed forward to climb into a chair. There was, however, a problem. Glinda had arranged the seating plan so that Meru was between the wizard and her father, directly across from Fiyero, who was in turn next to Nargene, all in respectful hierarchical order. But Fiyero refused to sit next to Nargene. Silently, but with absolutely no room for argument, Fiyero took his father's seat beside Meru, shifting the chair just enough so that his brother's face was entirely blocked by one large cake. Glinda's head jerked as she glanced between her friend and his assigned seat, lips pressed tight to keep from protesting his behavior. Tactfully, Harral just took the empty chair. The rest of the meal passed in the same strained, forced smile sort of way. There was a silent agreement that, for Meru's sake, no one would bring up the issue of what was actually wrong, but avoiding it became a painful endeavor. Fiyero was completely focused on his sister, making every effort to amuse and entertain her while flatly ignoring his brother, and only gave brief, barely polite responses to everyone else who spoke to him. After some time, it became clear, to Elphaba at least, that he was trying as hard as Glinda to keep up appearances because he didn't want Meru's day to be spoiled. At the same time, he was tense, jaw set tight, and no laughter ever reached his eyes. His cold rudeness was either patiently excused or ignored. Meru, thankfully, noticed nothing, and since talking to or about her was the only really safe subject, she was the center of attention and the happiest, most spoiled birthday girl in Oz. On the other hand, Nargene was quiet and still, speaking only when spoken to, though he too would smile for his sister and say that yes, of course everything was okay. He gave her a present, one present, his only present, which was well thought out and special, a necklace of tiny shells gathered from lake creatures, very rare and expensive, exactly the color of her eyes, and obviously something he'd put a great deal of time and thought into. She liked it and thanked him, putting it on and hugging him for it, but wasn't half as enthusiastic as when Fiyero showered her with his extravagant gifts, one after the other. From her seat beside Nargene, Elphaba couldn't help but feel sorry for him. All through this, there was absolutely nothing to hint at what was really going on. Glinda might have worked it out, being more intuitive when it came to the moods and feelings of her friends, but she was terribly upset by all this, desperately trying to ignore or excuse Fiyero's rudeness, Nargene's silence, and the general tension in the room. She was in no state to fix other people's problems, and Elphaba spent most of the meal talking quietly over the table, consoling her and promising that everything would be fine. This was always meant to be a visit with friends, not a state affair. It's not as though the Vinkus is going to be offended. Glinda put on a tight smile and said no, of course not, but she just wished everyone could just be happy. Elphaba wished so too. An hour later, after they'd all had their fill of real food, and Harral gave his daughter permission to eat her treats, Oscar produced 8 tall, thin candles that must have been specially made, and baffled the native Ozians by sticking them into the top of a cake. It took a little while for him to explain the strange traditions of his homeland without losing his wizardly appearance in the eyes of the Tigulars, but after he'd finished and sung all the way through a repetitive and truly ridiculous little song, Meru took a huge breath and blew as hard as she could on the burning candles. Fiyero had to help a bit, but they all went out. Oscar applauded, and Nargene smiled at his sister, and a servant took away the hot candles before wax could drip onto the cake. "What did you wish for?" asked Oscar. Her eyes lit up. "You gave me a wish?" Oscar froze. "Oh, well, I'm not sure there's anything left to wish for," said Harral kindly, but with an undercurrent of warning to his daughter not to be greedy, which she completely missed. "I think your brothers have already given you the best birthday in Oz." That wasn't true, really, as the single gift from Nargene could hardly compare with how Fiyero had spoiled the rotten. But no one said anything. Meru seemed to have taken the question literally. "I wish I could fly," she announced dreamily, fidgeting a little in her seat as thin slices were cut from each of the different cakes.
I had a dream I could fly. You know what happened in it?
She asked them all, looking around and expecting them to be interested. You flew? Elphaba asked dryly.
All around Oz, she exclaimed, nodding brightly. I was in our carriage and we were going to see Yarrow, and then there was no roof, and Daddy and Arjun were gone, and I could see the whole sky, and it was windy, and then I looked at the window, but there was no window, and I was flying.
She stopped her breath and to thank the servant who put the cake slices in front of her, before taking a big bite of the chocolate slice and barely remembering her manners long enough to swallow before continuing.
Know what happened next?
The adults all shook their heads and murmured polite no's, but it was Fiyero whom Meru was looking at, so he asked, What happened?
I was in the clouds! I was sitting on a flying cloud, and I could see the Emerald City and Munchkinland and Neverdale, and Mama was waving from the top of the castle, and the cloud turned into a carpet and a boat, and...
She stopped abruptly, halfway through bringing a bite of the second cake. This one plain with blue icing to her mouth. She looked at the wizard and asked,
Can you make me fly?
The wizard squirmed, though it was barely noticeable. He looked down the table to where his own daughter was starting on the lemon cake.
Elphaba,
can you? If Haral or Narjin found this odd, they said nothing. Perhaps they thought it was a test, or her duty, or something like that. Elphaba blinked and looked to Meru, who was watching her with big, hopeful eyes.
No, I can't. It's too dangerous to cast that sort of spell on a person, she explained. Sorry. But Yarrow said you made some monkeys fly?
She winced. Yarrow glanced up, looking at her long enough to convey apologies, then turned his head away before Narjin could catch his eye. Elphaba calmly put a fork down.
I did, yes, but it was an accident. The spell didn't work properly, and now I can't fix it. But they have wings, protested Meru, confused. They can fly. Yes, but you don't want to have wings like that, trust me, said Elphaba, jaw tight and trying very, very hard to block out the memory of screams. You didn't have them in your dream anyway, did you? She added lightly, trying to change the subject.
Meru shook her head, swallowing a little piece of the third cake, strawberry.
I was on a boat. The boat was flying, and the carriage. Can you make our carriage fly us home?
Elphaba opened her mouth to repeat that no, she couldn't, but paused, a thought striking her, and exchanged a glance with Glinda.
Maybe,
she said. Glinda looked thoughtful, finally distracted from the awkwardness of dinner.
With no enchanter to control it, Alfie, they wouldn't be able to steer unless
we give command to the object, said Elphaba, brow furrowed critically. A self-contained spell? It'd be dangerous.
Not if we weave the activating spell into a second object. We'd have to change the verbs to indefinites.
We'd need at least 3 of them.
Or there could be a trigger word, or a mix of both. Your pointing spell could be adjusted. Maybe a magically receptive object could test it easily enough.
As was their habit, the 2 sorceresses had all but forgotten the rest of the world as ideas struck and were ricocheted back and forth between them. It was amusing in that both were entirely unaware of it, but Meru was confused and looking to her big brother for help. He, like Oscar, knew his girls very well and just said, they'll try. Trying seemed to be the theme of the night. According to Glinda's carefully laid out plan for the evening, after dinner their party of 7 was supposed to retire to a formal sitting room to sip tea and talk. In some ways this was easier than the meal had been, since they weren't obliged to stay in a single group. But in other ways it was worse. After spending the rest of dinner scribbling notes and speaking what seemed like gibberish, Elphaba and Glinda had said that there may very well be a way to enchant large objects to fly at the command of a non-magical driver, but it would take a lot of work. In the meantime, however, they were perfectly able to make Mira's actual dream come true, and had her sit on a small rug, which they levitated around the room, carefully directing it up and down with their hands. She shrieked with joy. Once it was over, and after she'd given both women a happy hug, Meru sat down with Elphaba and begged her to explain exactly how the magic worked, even though she hadn't been able to follow a word at dinner. Elphaba tried anyway, more so that she could sit with Fiyero, who stayed with his sister and always kept smiling, until his eyes landed on his brother. Elphaba was trying to work out what was going on, why he was so upset. She was sure those tattoos had something to do with it, and what she could possibly do to keep the evening from falling apart altogether. She failed. Narjin was staying close to his father and Oscar. Somehow that only seemed to upset Fiyero more. Glinda oscillated, first spending time with Harald and Oscar and then trying to talk to her friends. But when she made a light comment about how nice it must be to have a little sister and if she had younger siblings, "Don't, Glinda," snapped Fiyero in a harsh whisper that Meru, briefly talking to her father, couldn't hear. "Stay out of this." That hurt her. And after a stunned moment of silence, Glinda stood up to use the washroom, taking a few deep and shaky breaths as she went. Elphaba hit him. "What is wrong with you?" she hissed. "You wouldn't understand," he replied, and immediately turned back to Meru, grinning brightly as she returned with some miscellaneous bit of news. Harald was looking up and saw this, but never said a word. Eventually, and to the mutual relief of every adult, Meru began to fall asleep. Her day had been wonderful, but exhausting, and after she shook herself out of a doze for the third time, it was tactfully suggested that she go to bed. Meru protested, but a series of huge yawns betrayed her. Then, after standing up to thank every person in the room and hug most of them, the wizard still seemed to awe her a little, and Elphaba clearly wasn't a hugging type, she took the hand of her patient and smiling nanny and waved as she walked out of the room. The moment that door shut, the tension shattered. "Fiyero," Narjin began, but too late. Fiyero was already on his feet and storming out of another door, slamming it behind him. Elphaba had followed him immediately, but the palace corridors were a twisting maze, and he'd vanished around a corner before she could reach him. A while later, she finally tracked him down, finding that instead of distracting himself in the game room or vanishing out into the bars in town, he had actually gone and shut himself in his rooms. Something that was unusual in itself. He rarely spent time in that suite if he wasn't sleeping or eating, or sleeping with her, to be perfectly honest. And that he had done so now was strange, unless of course part of him wanted to be found. There was no answer to her knock, but Elphaba wasn't surprised. She let herself in, closing the door behind her before walking up to the fireplace, where Fiyero sat silently in an armchair, facing the dancing flames. His face was hard, and he rested his chin in one hand, thinking. He didn't acknowledge her, but when she took the nearest seat and asked, "Do you plan to sulk the whole time they're here?" he sighed. "I'm not sulking, Elphaba," he said, eyes on the fire. "I know it looks like it, but I have a reason. I have a right to be angry. You made Glinda cry, you know. She worked really hard to learn Vinkin etiquette, and it barely lasted 2 minutes. She'll get over it." Elphaba blinked, startled. "It's not like you to say something like that." That apparently got to him. He dropped his arm and shook his head, sighing. "You're right, I'm sorry. I'll apologize to her later." "And your brother?" "He doesn't deserve it." Wondering if she had ever been this stubborn, and knowing that she probably had, Elphaba shook her head. After a moment's thought, she dragged her chair over until she was blocking his view of the fire and asked one question. "Why?" Fiyero frowned, hesitated, but finally answered. "There's a tradition. A very old Arjiki tradition of using special tattoos to announce who we are and why we're important. You've probably read about it. A few centuries ago, everyone wore them, but chief families like mine had the most elaborate patterns. Most people got lazy and stopped doing it, but it's still habit for our leaders to wear at least something small to show they're Arjiki and proud of it." Elphaba was puzzled. "I've only ever seen your father wear it. He's the only one who does since my grandfather died. My great-great-grandfather had the idea of taking tattoos at the same time as taking the crown. So ever since, wearing the diamonds has been more or less a symbol of being king." Suddenly understanding, Elphaba winced. "And by being tattooed now, before your father steps down—" "Narjin's basically saying that he expects to get the crown," finished Fiyero. "He thinks I'm not good enough." "Well, that's going a bit far," said Elphaba, trying to sound reasonable. "He's your brother. Maybe he thinks the tradition should change to include your entire family. You're all royal, after all." "No, Narjin's in love with tradition. He thinks any changes are disrespectful and wouldn't do it unless it was a question of life or death. He always thinks he's right anyway." "Does he? Fiyero, you've only seen him twice in the last 3 years. Maybe he's grown up." "Sure he has. Enough to think he's ready to be king." Elphaba upped, frustrated. "You're being ridiculous." "Don't you mean really stupid?" "Stop it!" She snapped, perhaps more harshly than she would have if she wasn't still feeling guilty for that years-old slight. I think you'd be a good king. I've seen you working hard to help us, and I know you can do it. What Najin thinks doesn't matter. It's up to your father to choose which of you will be the best for the country. And Najin spent all his time working at home and showing off what he could do. Father let him have the tattoos. He wouldn't do that unless he's already decided. You can't know that, insisted Elphaba, though she was skating thin ice, for she couldn't come up with one reasonable explanation that might console him. Biting back her temper, she leaned forward, reaching for his hand. Why don't you talk to them? She suggested. Your father, at least? Ask him what's happened. No. Fiyero, no! She sighed irritably as he slumped back in the chair, refusing to look at her and allowing his eyes to drift over some boring bit of architecture, cheek resting on his fist again, definitely sulking. Fine, she said, standing and shoving her chair back as she went. Fine. Then I will. He didn't answer, which only annoyed her more, and she left, shutting the door more loudly than necessary. Fiyero didn't care. He loved Elphaba, but she didn't understand. She couldn't. She hadn't spent her life thinking her family loved her, only to be so harshly and abruptly let down. No wonder his mother had to come along for the trip. She never believed her elder son could make a good king. Not since he was a child, at least. She wasn't heartless, but being royalty had never stopped the Tigulars from shouting and fighting just like any other family, and Amadel had long since become fed up with the bickering of her children. She wouldn't have seen the point of coming along. Harral, however. Fiyero had always thought of himself as being close to his family despite his scandalous behavior, and closest of all to his father. They had been harmonic, always spending a lot of time together, and as a child, it was his father he'd always gone to with his troubles, not his mother. Harral was the calm one, the gentle one, the one who would give him a hug to make it all better and quietly explain why mother was angry or the baby was in tears. Fiyero might have been prepared for such a cruel gesture from his brother, but never, ever from Harral. For the 20 or so minutes that Elphaba was gone, probably asking around for a logical explanation, he thought souredly. Fiyero wallowed in his hurt. He wasn't like her. He couldn't analyze his feelings or pack them away one by one into neatly organized boxes. He felt them, and he felt them in full. So by the time the door to his suite opened again, he was quite thoroughly swallowed up in resentment. You should have just sent a letter, he said loudly, not looking up. Or did you think it was that obvious that only Narjin would be good enough for the Venkus? Father didn't know, said an unexpected voice, and Fiyero whipped around to see his brother looking contrite and sheepish, standing uncomfortably some distance away. He opened his mouth wanting to say more, but had no chance. Get out. Look at me. I don't want to talk. I'm sorry, declared Narjin, and it was enough to forestall being thrown out by force. I was at the party. I was drinking, and I thought it was a good idea. I wish I hadn't. Well, you did. And I don't think even Elphaba's spells could get rid of them, even if you'd want her to. Narjin scowled. I never said I didn't, Fiyero. You're putting words in my mouth. Again, he added with some resentment of his own. I thought you'd understand what it's like to do something stupid and regret it in the morning. Fiyero flinched. I never did anything like that. I don't care if you were drunk. It doesn't change things. Father hasn't said anything to me about being king. We both know he's been grooming you since the day I was expelled from Quox, replied Fiyero, looking at the fireplace again. Why don't you just head the next council meeting and be done with it? Or have they already asked you to? Narjin frowned. You know what? This isn't all about you. I could be a good king, Fiyero. I've worked really hard for it. But you're the elder brother, and I respect that. I didn't get these. He waved a hand at the left to his face. Just to hurt you. But you think the only reason I could be king is because I'm older. Thanks a lot. Being neither exceptionally diplomatic nor particularly patient, this was more than Narjin could take. I came here to apologize, he snapped. I guess I shouldn't have bothered. He left abruptly, making for the third slammed door of the evening. Fiyero sighed. He didn't regret anything he'd said, but part of him wished it wouldn't drive everyone away so fast.
The fire crackled.
Fiero's mood didn't change. Not long after, Elphaba's voice could be heard through the thick wood of the door. Worried? Frustrated? Mostly worried. The door opened and Harald came in, quiet and somber. He didn't patronize his son with any of the empty consolations he'd have offered a child. Instead, he said,
"Your mother and I never approved of Narjin taking the diamonds like that. He was wrong to do so."
Though now he already knew this, Fiero softened a little at the confirmation.
His father took a seat in the armchair Elphaba had left, smooth, efficient, and calm.
"Do you want him to be king?"
asked Fiero, without venom, but his eyes were still fixed on the flames. Harald sighed.
"Son, I don't know," he said. "I wish I didn't have to choose at all. But Narjin will finish his degree soon, and I'm getting old."
He sank back into the cushioned chair, weary bones appreciating its comfort.
"Your brother is capable. This one lapse in judgment aside, he's also been very respectful. He knows you have first right to the crown, and has never acted as anything other than second in line. But he wants the job."
Harald nodded slowly.
"He wants it. I don't think he knows what else he'll do with his life, but he could find something. The question, Fiero, is whether or not you want it."
At last, Harald's son looked at him, firelight flickering across his face. He seemed vulnerable. His voice was flat.
"Would you let me?"
Very serious. The older man leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees.
"Yes," he said. "Yes, Fiero, I'd be proud to make you a king. I have had my doubts."
And that was the understatement of the year.
"But the things you've done since coming to the city, I couldn't be more impressed. Your mother has taken to reading newspapers in bed every morning just to see what else you've done. You haven't been home much," he noted. "That's a problem, but as long as you spend a few years in the Vinkers before I step down, it shouldn't make a difference. But Fiero—"
He hesitated, and Fiero, who had been feeling a wonderful glow of joy ballooning inside his chest, froze.
"What?" "We need to decide soon. I have a few good years left, but I'm getting tired, and I don't want to be working until I die. Your brother will finish school within the year, and it wouldn't be fair to let him keep hoping. Now, I could make a public statement as early as tomorrow morning, but I need to know. Do you want to be king?"
For a long time, Fiero was quiet. Harald waited patiently, watching as his son considered the future. Fiero's eyes roamed the room, touching on a few gathered trinkets, some pictures, and a woman's black coat hanging over the couch and evidently forgotten some time ago. He looked out the windows at the snow, then back to the fire and up to his father's face. The thin, whirling pattern of blue tattoos stared back at him.
"No,"
he said at last.
"No, Dad, I don't."
Harald paused, searching for any trace of doubt in Fiero's usually open, very readable face.
There was none.
"Why?"
He shrugged, leaning back in the chair.
"I never wanted it, really. I just don't want to be the idiot brother who couldn't do the job."
That was reasonable, if hard for a father to listen to.
"We don't doubt you, Fiero."
"You did," he replied. "You and Mother and Narjin and half the Vinkis and most of us. I want to prove them wrong, but that's the only real reason, and it's not good enough." Shrugging, he added, "I like it here, Dad. I like what I do. I miss home, but I want to stay. And if that means that everyone but you and Meru and Elphaba think I'm not good enough, I don't really care." Oh, but he did care. And Aral knew his son better than to believe that. He could have protested, argued that Amadel and Narjin also knew he was capable, as did Lady Glinda and the wizard himself, apparently, but he also knew that words, even ones as true as those, wouldn't mean much to his son. He needed something more, something tangible. Some kind of gesture. And he had one.
"You know,"
he said lightly,
My great-grandfather had a good idea when he decided to associate the Aujiki diamonds with the crown. He sent a very clear message to everyone about who he was and why he was worthy of respect.
Fiyero glanced up, puzzled. Quietly, but with an intense look in his eyes, Harral added,
I have the blue ink with me. If you'd like, I think you should wear them too, King Ano. You're my son, Fiyero, and I want everyone to know that I'm proud of you.
Dad, breathed Fiyero, taken aback and deeply touched.
Thanks.
Come morning, Elphaba was getting a little worried. Neither Harral nor Fiyero had been seen since she led the Vinkin King to his son's room, grumbling all the time about stupid petitions and stupid symbolism. Harral had said nothing, just let her rant. But when they reached the door and she turned the handle, he'd paused and said,
Thank you for caring about him.
Then he vanished. After sharing breakfast with Glinda and evading Meru, who had woken up with a stomachache that dulled their usual enthusiasm, Elphaba had pretended to work for an hour before giving it up as hopeless. 5 minutes later, she was outside Fiero's door again. She knocked and called his name. A faint, low sound was the only reply. Inside, it was dark and stuffy. The fireplace must have snuffed out on its own sometime during the night, and the curtains were all still shut, light twinkling through their weak spots and around the edges. Elphaba walked towards them, and in the dim light she noticed the painfully thin steel needles that lay on a plate on the low parlor table next to a bowl of stale water. When she pulled open the curtains, there was a sudden moan. Turning around, she found Fiyero lying on the couch, curled on his side, with an arm raised to shield his eyes. He was still dressed in the same clothes as he'd worn at dinner, and one palm was pressed to his face, holding down a cloth stained with brown and blue. He looked pathetic. Elphaba opened the window anyway, letting in the fresh air, and then sat down beside him, blocking the most direct light with her body.
Sorry,
he said, blindly reaching for her hand.
Sorry I was grumpy.
She accepted, squeezing his fingers, but said, It's not me you need to say sorry to.
I know. I'll find Glinda and Eugene later.
He opened his eyes, then winced and burrowed back into the pillow.
I'm not going to be king.
Elphaba hesitated, still holding his hand. You don't sound too upset about that.
Not, he said. That's funny.
He squinted up at her, and possibly deciding that he just wasn't up for explaining it, forced himself to sit. He took his hand, and what looked like the remnants of a cloth-covered ice pack, away from the left side of his face. He had the tattoos. They were beautiful. Thin lines of blue diamonds interlocking in chains traced the rim of his eyebrow and swirled down his temple, joining up in a larger diamond shape before running down his cheek. 4 more lines wrapped lightly around the curve of his forehead, the highest just brushing his hairline. There were so many, all so small, linking into each other. It must have taken hours. His face was swollen and obviously sore. Reddened skin shone with a layer of grease, partly wiped off by the cloth. It was some kind of ointment with a faintly herbal smell, obviously part of the healing process. She reached out, then stopped, pulling her hand back. Fiyero smiled, though clearly it hurt a bit.
Go ahead, touch, he said. I don't mind.
Careful, as gently as she knew how, Elphaba traced her fingertips over the new pattern, feeling the remaining grease slide as she moved. She touched the end of each of the diamond chain on his forehead, following the delicate lines down to the edge of his eye, then sliding lower towards his mouth. Your father did this?
He wants them to know he's proud of me. He loves me.
She smiled. I know. Shifting a little,
Fiyero added, I should have known. I was being an idiot, wasn't I?
Yes, well, mostly. You were hurt. You did have a right to be angry. I'm glad, though. He turned, puzzled.
Glad.
With a little laugh, Elphaba leaned forward and kissed him, briefly tasting the ointment. Glad, she said. I like your diamonds.